Hello, everybody. I am Andrea Keefe, the Meetings and Events Coordinator with IPC. I'm very excited to kick off today's webinar on IPC's Job Task Analysis Committee. It's important to note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you via email a few business days concluding this webinar. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please send your questions using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If we have time at the end of the webinar, we will go through the questions and answers at that time. Today, I am pleased to welcome Dave Hernandez to be our featured speaker. Dave is the Senior Director of Online Learning at IPC. I'll now turn it over to you, Dave.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Hernandez. I'm a Senior Director with IPC in the Certification and Education space. So I'm pleased to announce and talk about the Job Task Analysis Committee with you all today. The presentation today should run close to about 30 minutes, so we should have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. And because it's kind of an intimate group today, we should have no problem getting through everyone's questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by going through the agenda of what I want to talk about today. The first thing that we're really going to talk about is what is a JTA and what the scope of this committee that we formed is. The committee was formed in December of last year. Some of the subcommittees started meeting back in 2017 and have been meeting throughout 2018. Some subcommittees are still kind of in the forming stages. So we'll talk about all of that. We'll talk about why we're going through the JTA process, why it's an important thing for IPC to do this with the industry. We'll talk about the committee structure. Then we'll spend some time talking about the different steps that the committees will go through in the JTA process. We'll talk about competency models, we'll talk about how to join the committees, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So what is a job task analysis? So this is a term that is used a lot in education and in certification circles, and is an integral part of the development of certification programs and in the development of learning. So often the job task analysis, and I will be referring to it as a JTA, is often seen as the first step in a lot of these processes. So what is a JTA? So a JTA really is a roadmap. So the idea of what a job task analysis is it's trying to map out a particular job role. It creates a roadmap for individuals who are designing learning and certification opportunities for those students. So when you look at what a JTA is, from a more granular, more practical perspective, it's kind of a formal process in which you verify certain information. So what you do is you look at a particular job role. And so for the sake of this example, I'll say operator. And we're going to say, okay, we're going to look at the operator job role in the electronics industry. And what we want to determine and verify is what are the tasks that the typical operator does in fulfilling their job function, right? Besides looking at the tasks, we want to look at what are the conditions under which those tasks are performed. Okay, because that can vary drastically from industry to industry and even from subset of an industry to other subsets of the industry. Then you want to kind of look at what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that individuals have to perform and have to have in order to perform these tasks. And this is where we really start to get into that granularity to help build out certification and education programs and really to understand the job role. So if the first aspect of it is to determine that that this is a task that's completed, this area here where we're talking about knowledge, skills, and abilities is really trying to understand what are the things that an individual needs to know and be able to do in order to fulfill that task. And then we want to map out what is the frequency and importance of these tasks, because there could be a task that is performed every day by someone in this job role, and there could be a task that maybe is only performed once a month typically for this job role. And then there's also, well, just because it's performed more frequently, is it more important of a task than the one that's performed once a month? So these are questions that the JTA seeks out to answer. And then finally, all this information is collected It's reviewed, it's built by subject matter experts in the industry, and then it's going to be validated by the industry as a whole. And when it's all done, it gets formatted and distributed as a document outlining the information above. So this is not just information that is collected and utilized by a certifying body or by an educational body like IPC. This is really something that is done for the industry as a whole. And the idea here, again, is to have a really deep understanding of these jobs, what is needed in these jobs, and how these jobs have changed over time, for example, for everyone in the industry. So what is the scope of the JTA committee, and what is it? Understanding kind of broadly what a JTA is, and we'll get into a lot more detail on that in a moment. What is the scope of the committee? Why did we form this committee? So the committee is a group of industry subject matter experts. And the idea here was that in the past, IPC has relied upon a very small group of people to understand our certification and education programs, and to really have an understanding of the job roles. And what we wanted to do with this process was broaden that. We wanted to get as much of the industry involved as possible. This is a committee that is open to anyone around the world, from any size organization, from any part of the electronics industry. So we wanted OEMs, EMS companies, manufacturers. We wanted to have, designers and operators and managers and CEOs involved, and we wanted to have it from small mom and pop companies all the way to multinational organizations. And the idea is that we wanted to kind of map out these job roles and see if we can understand if there are differences in these job roles across different countries and across different sectors of the industry. And the whole idea is to really map out at the end of all of this a competency model for the electronics industry, or competency models for the electronics industry. And so the way that we accomplish that is really going to be by defining the tasks, the key roles or key jobs in the electronic industry are performing, and then driving the idea of building a job task analysis for each one of these roles or group of roles. Because just because we said operator doesn't mean that there's only one job task analysis or one operator. There may very well be multiple types of operators. There may be the operator that works in manufacturing may differ significantly from an assembler that works for an EMS company. And so part of the job task analysis is to understand those roles and to do an analysis of each of those roles to make those determinations. So why go through this process? As I just said before, one of the key ones is to understand these job roles. I'm relatively new to IPC. I joined IPC about 1.5 years ago, and when I joined IPC, I've come from manufacturing, so I've spent my career in manufacturing, but never in the electronics industry. And so when we start asking some of these questions about, an operator, well, are all operators the same? Do they all do the same job functions? Do they need different skills? And we didn't really have any means of answering that. So really, the first goal here and the first idea why we went through and started the JTA process was we felt that IPC needed to better understand critical job roles in the electronics industry, and then help disseminate that information to the rest of the industry so that everyone kind of had that data. We wanted to clearly define the roles, responsibilities, tasks, and competencies for each of those job roles. So if there are multiple operators, let's take a look at what are the roles and responsibilities and skills that each one of those needs, and is there overlap? Are they completely different? How similar are they? Or can we take someone from one of those job roles and theoretically retrain them to do another one? We talk a lot about the idea of aligning what we're doing in certification and education to what the industry needs are, and that's very important to us. There have been programs that have been very successful for IPC for a long time, but the programs really haven't necessarily evolved or changed with the industry. And this is an industry that changes fairly rapidly. So we want to make sure that we are supporting the industry in every way that we can. So this kind of leads into areas outside of education and certification, though. So in the traditional sense of what IPC has been involved in, as you may have heard over the last several weeks and months, we are making a significant push into STEM education, into trying to help close the skill gap, in driving new talent into the industry. We're partnering with academic institutions, schools, to kind of draw students into the industry. And in order to do that effectively, though, we need to understand what is the skill gap. Where are those skills what are those skills that we don't have, and why don't we have them? And so the job task analysis helps outline that information. And then finally, kind of building on that same idea of drawing new talent into the industry and maintaining talent is really just help start developing career pathways and job resources to recruit new talent. It's hard to turn to a student and say, hey, come into the electronics industry. There's potential here for you to have a job, and then not be able to answer what those jobs are, or what those jobs entail, or what skills they need in order to do those jobs, what education they need to do those jobs. So the job task analysis helps answer those fundamental questions that are going to help drive the strategy of IPC moving forward. So in December of last year, we formed the committee, and our goal is to have 100 companies in the electronics industry volunteer members to be part of the committee. This is a volunteer committee. Right now, we're getting close to about half of our goal. So we're getting close to about 50. We have somewhere, I believe, over 40 companies involved in the committee. And so the committee is structured where there is a main committee, all right, of all members. So all members of all the subcommittees are invited into the main committee meetings. All of our meetings are done via Skype. To allow for international participation. It's very important for us that we have international representation, that this is not a US-centric committee. This is not a US-centric outcome, that the job task analysis is really reflective of the industry as a whole. Typically, the meetings last about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And so the main committee's responsibility, and the main committee really, like I said, is only going to meet about 4 times a year. Their responsibility is to oversee the work of the subcommittees, where most of the job task analysis work is going to be performed, to help recruit new members into the committee, to identify and define the job roles. So this is something that the main committee did at the end of last year, was that they made the determination on these are the top 6 job roles we're going to start, or job families that we're going to start looking at. And then finally, once the JTAs are completed, before they're validated by the industry, they'll be reviewed by the committee as a whole for any comment for the subcommittees. So the subcommittees, or the subgroups of the main committee, are each responsible for developing the job task analysis for a particular job family. And so the typical JTA may require somewhere in the vicinity of 6 to 8 meetings to complete. If there are multiple JTAs that are being worked on at the same time, that might become 10 meetings, but typically that's what you tend to see as far as how long it takes to do this. And we typically are trying to meet no more than once a month, but sometimes it may be 6 weeks, sometimes it may be 3 weeks, depending on the committee's flexibility and need. And some of the work that's done on the JTA can actually be done virtually, asynchronously, through shared documents. And again, all the meetings are held over Skype. So currently we have 6 subcommittees. Okay, these are the 6 subcommittees. And so when we talk about job families, this is what we're talking about. So we have operator, instructor, inspector, program manager, design technician, engineer, production technician, engineer. And so when we talk about families of jobs, if you take any one of these, the question always becomes, is there a singular job that belongs in this family? So for example, the operator subcommittee has been fairly active, and they've met several times. And one of the discussions that we've been having is there only one type of operator, or are there multiple types of operators? So at the moment, we still don't have an answer to that. We are mapping the knowledge, skills, and abilities and all the tasks for the operators. And then we're going to see which of the operators do each of those tasks apply to, and then try to understand where's the overlap. Because it may be that 90% of the skills, knowledge, and abilities for the operators are the similar regardless of what type of operator you are. It may be that only 50% are. So the committee is really trying to answer these questions by looking at this from across the industry. So let's look at what are the steps in the JTA process, and I'll try to kind of give you guys a little bit of the of an actual real world examples of these. And so what I did was I actually pulled some examples of JTAs that I'll show you now as we go through this, but I also talk a little bit about what the committees are doing. So the first step is really to define the job roles, and this is important because there is a difference between what is termed a job title and a job role. So when you say a job title, really what we're talking about is the name of a job, right? So something like operator, we hear this all the time, operator, these are operators, or these are assemblers, right? But really what we're looking for is to define the job role. So the idea here is really a description of what it is that this person does, right? What are their primary job responsibilities? Because oftentimes what you'll see in an industry is that you may have different parts of the industry or different geographic areas of the industry call the same job function or job role by very different titles. And so our interest here really is in focusing on the role of the person, not necessarily on their title. All right, and that's why we consider the role on a functional and a behavioral level, not necessarily just on a title level. So really what we're trying to understand is what is the day-to-day function of this individual? What are the behaviors that this individual does? And so when we define the job role, that's really what we're doing is we're creating a short description of what it is that this person does, and what are their primary responsibilities. So then we can say, now that we have this becomes our baseline for how we define operators. And then we can start looking at the nuance of that and say, okay, are there more than one operator or not? So the main committee defines the list. So we built out the list, and actually we built out a list that was much longer than the 6 subcommittees that we had, but we decided to focus on those 6 first. And then each role that we define becomes a subcommittee, and the subcommittee develops the JTA. So the second part of this is, and this is where the subcommittee work actually starts here, is so now that you've kind of defined broadly what is the function and the behavior of this individual, you need to start describing the domain, tasks, and subtasks that someone in that job role will perform. Okay, so in order to do this, and I think the best way to illustrate this is really we're trying to answer 3 questions. Right, so the first question is, what are the tasks that an individual in this role would be required to perform? Okay, so let's take an example of someone that is a police officer, for example, right? That's a role that I think everyone can relate to in some capacity, right? So a police officer, a task that a police officer may have to perform is, for example, a police officer would have to issue traffic citations. Okay, that's typical of a police officer. But notice how that is we're talking about a specific thing, a specific task that person in that role would be expected to perform. Then the second question, and this is after you've defined a task, is how often is this task performed? Okay, is this task something that they're expected to do every day? On a reasonable level, every day they're going to be performing this task. Is this a task that is rarely performed, right? So while the first question gives us kind of the general task, that second question starts to help us figure out the frequency of this. And the reason is because when you take into account frequency in the next question, you start to understand how important of a task it is. So if the second question is about how often it's performed, the third question is how important are these tasks to the individual's success. So for example, if there's a task that is only performed once a month and an individual that is in this job role cannot perform it, will they have a job? Or is that task so important that they need to have a job, or is it not important enough that if they really can't do it, it's not that big of a deal? So the combination of these 3 questions helps us understand what are the tasks that an individual has to perform in that job role, right? Then what we do is we take a look at, once we've defined all the tasks, and there may be a large list of 60 tasks, you start to combine those tasks into groups of similar tasks. And these are what are called domains, right? And I'm going to give you an example now. This is from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory job task analysis for a job called an energy auditor. And an energy auditor is basically an individual that goes to a home or to a business and does an energy audit. They take a look at the energy consumption of the building. They do measurements, and they let you know how energy can be conserved, how you can lower your costs, things like that. So they have a domain here that, and I'm gonna take my my highlighter function here a little bit. So you have a domain here, right? That is collect information about the building for an energy audit. Okay, so this task, this domain here is a group of tasks. All right, each one of these is an individual task that belongs to this domain. All right, so for example, collect attic data is an individual task, right? Collect window data is another task. Collect building measurements. So these are all tasks that an energy auditor would be expected to do. And when you combine them all, right, these are all about collecting information about the building for an energy audit. All right, let me erase this here. So once you've defined all the tasks, so once all of these tasks have been listed out, right, the next thing you want to do is you want to develop the KSAs for each task. So KSA is short for knowledge, skill, and ability. So when we talk about knowledge, we're really talking about a body of information that an individual needs to know in order to perform that task. So this is really kind of just the knowledge base, right? What is it that I need to know and understand in order to perform that task? What are the skills? So these are typically manual, verbal, or mental manipulations of data, people, things in order to perform that task, and the ability. So the ability, so if a skill is the ability, if knowledge is mental and skill is kind of the practical kinesthetic manifestation of that, abilities is the behavioral side, right? So with each task, you want to break it down and say, okay, these are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need to have in order to perform that task. So let's go back to that, that example we had before. One of the tasks here was to collect building measurements, right? We discussed that before. And so in a job task analysis, you need to be able to identify the ability to, so these are behaviors, the knowledge of, and the skills that you need to have in order to perform that individual task. And so those tasks, those abilities can be things like measuring things. Like these are all different types of measurements that an individual needs to be able to do. Knowledge of, how to calculate something, how to identify something, how to measure a building's component, various components of the building, and then skills in measuring, basic math, attention to detail, things like that. So the idea is that for each task, and remember how we had a list of tasks in that domain, you're going to build this out so that we know exactly what are the things that an individual needs to be able to do and needs to be able to know in order to perform that task. Once you've mapped out all of the tasks, then the next aspect of this is you have to prioritize those tasks. You asked the question of how often is a task performed, how critical is the task for the success in the job performance, and how difficult is the task to perform. And so these questions are very important. So take a step back and think of yourself as a hiring manager, right? And take any one of those tasks that we talked about, right? If there was one task, for example, or if there was a series of tasks that were identified as being critical, right, for the performing of that job role, wouldn't you prioritize those tasks and make them a higher priority when you're hiring people? Wouldn't you focus on making sure that individuals could do those tasks first, because those are the critical ones? What if there's a task that they have to perform every day? Wouldn't you prioritize those tasks over others? So it's important to understand these things as part of the JTA process, because it's going to be a big determiner in how we're able to later on determine that we're going to have validation for individuals to get the certification, or training programs for them, or to help companies hire the right people, or to help schools train the right people in order to output employees that are ready to start working. So this kind of prioritization is very important. It's typically done at the end of the JTA process, and this will also help be validated, as we'll see in the next step, by the industry. So the job task analysis is built by subject matter experts, but really it's for the industry by the industry. So typically what's done is at the end of the process, after the JTA has been completed by the committee, a validation study is typically performed. In our case, it'll be done by a psychometrician. A psychometrician is an expert in statistical analysis and in behavioral analysis, as well as in the development of assessments and things like that. So typically this is a PhD who specializes in these areas. So there'll be a validation study done by a psychometrician. And then what happens is that the psychometrician will actually validate each element. So each task, each KSA, the criticality and frequency and importance of each one. And this is done in order to develop a relevance metrics, which is then utilized by IPC, for example, to develop training and certification programs, but can also be utilized by the industry in developing kind of job descriptions or internal training programs, or programs for schools, things like that. It even works with government. Governments are, at least in the United States, I can say that governments are very invested in the JTA process. They utilize this a lot when they're determining things like education standards and things like that for the states. So this validation study is typically done in a variety of different ways. The way, it could be done, for example, by having a second JTA committee that does the same thing independently, and then you compare the results. The way that we're going to be doing it at IPC is our preferred method, and it's the method that I think gives you the best results, which is that we will survey the industry with this information and have the industry validate and make comments on it. So once all that's done, part of the goal of what we're trying to do here is to build a competency model. So what's a competency model? Competency model is a framework where you can kind of create a visual framework of the skills and knowledge requirements for a particular job. It's really, and so it's a competency model because it's a collection of competencies. So it's a combination of hard skills, which are typically like technical skills, and soft skills. And the idea here is that these are, at the end of the day, these are the skills and knowledge you need to have in order to perform this job. This is an example of a competency model and what a competency model looks like. This is from the food and beverage service competency model that we utilize in the United States. And as you can see here is that these have tiers, right? And as you increase in tier, you have more specialization of skill, and you have the difficulty of skill increases. So for example, at the bottom of the competency model, you have personal effectiveness competency. So these are kind of soft skills that really focus on, these are the things that an individual, the behaviors that an individual needs to be able to have. So for example, professionalism and integrity, motivation, right? These are things that maybe you can't necessarily teach very effectively in a school. I mean, maybe you can refine and improve, but a lot of these have to do with individual competencies. Then you get into the academic competencies, and so these are the competencies that you actually gain from school. So things like basic computer skills, communication skills, math, writing, reading. And then you have workplace competencies. These are competencies that are kind of developed in the workplace. So you have things like problem solving, decision making, being customer focused, teamwork. Then you get into competencies that deal with industry-wide. So these are the competencies that basically virtually anyone in the industry needs. And then you get into the industry sectors or technical competencies. So this is where you start to see a break off and saying, okay, well, if you work in, using our industry as an example, manufacturing, kind of these are the industry specific competencies you need. Whereas if you work in an EMS company, this would be the competencies that you need. And then you kind of get into the higher level kind of specific competencies to do a particular job. Okay, and so these types of competency models are very important because they give us a visual representation of what the JTA process is. So if you're interested in joining the JTA committee, we're looking for as much industry representation as possible. We're not stopping this at 100 people either. We can have 300 people as part of the committee. We're really looking to have the best cross section to validate the data as possible. If you're interested in joining, you can send me an email. My email is davidhernandez@ipc.org. When you send me your email, please make sure to include your name, email address, the company you work for, and your title. And then also let me know which subcommittees you're interested in joining. You're not limited to only joining one. If you would like to join multiple subcommittees, you're more than welcome to join multiple subcommittees. If you want to join one subcommittee and maybe there's someone else in your organization that you think would be a better fit for another subcommittee, please do so. One of the questions I get very often is what type of people am I looking for? And so really what we're looking for is anyone who has knowledge and expertise in being able to share with the committee what are the tasks, knowledge, skills, and abilities that a particular job that a particular job needs. So for example, take someone at the operator level. We can take someone who's been an operator for 10 years and that person would be able to kind of participate in the committee and give us that information, as well as someone who's a supervisor who supervises operators on a day-to-day basis, as well as maybe even someone in HR who is responsible for hiring and interviewing and bringing in new operators. So there's a variety of different job roles that can kind of contribute to the committee, and really we're welcoming of all of them. And that's about the 30-minute mark, like I promised. So if there's any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Just please go ahead, and if you have a question, write it into the question box, and I'll be more than happy to answer it for you. As was mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the webinar is going to be sent out to all the attendees. And as well, I think I also posted online if I'm not mistaken. So I had a question here: is what is IPC going to do with these JTAs? So we're going to do a couple of things. One is we're going to produce them into a document, and then we're going to distribute them for free to all of our membership. So all the companies that are part of IPC, and we'll have a web page dedicated to them where you can go and download these JTAs. And so what is industry going to utilize this for? For a few things. One, it's going to be utilized for, it can be utilized for helping develop job descriptions. It could be helped, you can help utilize it to help build competency pathways for people in your employment. It can be utilized to help recruitment, things like that. We're going to use it for a variety of different things. We're going to utilize them to redefine our certification and education programs to better align with what the industry needs in each of these roles. We're going to utilize that information to help build career information for students, so that we can build resources to help draw students into the industry and show them the different careers they can have. We want to use it to help align what schools are doing in CTE programs and career and technical education programs with what we need in the industry to help, again, close some of that skill gap, to work with other organizations to help them kind of define what should be taught and how it should be taught in order to prepare for the needs. So this becomes the baseline of a lot of the things that we want to be doing over the next decade in education. And this is not a one-time thing. You know, after we complete these 6 subcommittee JTAs, we'll work on another 6 or another 5 or another 10. And at every 2 or 3 years, we will revisit those same JTAs to make sure that they're refreshed and that we're still aligned with everything we're doing. When are the JTA meetings expecting to commence? So some of the subcommittees have been meeting since last year. Some of them are starting up soon. It depends on which subcommittee you're talking about, but it's never too late to join. We're always looking for new members. Will this be utilized? Will a functional type of standard be made? For example, mixing acceptability standards from 600, 610, 620 to create an inspector functional module. That is close to what our intent is. So our intent is not necessarily to build a new standard. The standards are driven by the standards committee. Our intent is to, if we develop, for example, an inspector certification, that the certification is not based just on one standard, but really on the skills, knowledge, and abilities that an individual would need to be able to perform in order to act as an inspector for the industry. And so when an individual gets certified as an inspector, we're actually validating that that individual has those knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then also being able to build training resources for the industry, courses, things like that, to help build and create and to create a pathway for people to be able to become an inspector in the industry and help fill that need. Which subcommittees have the greatest need for more people? Probably the engineering ones. Have the biggest need, believe it or not. Those I think are the smallest subcommittees at the moment. The 2 subcommittees for engineers, and those are subcommittees that are looking at not just the engineers function, but also the technician function and the interaction between those 2 groups. If there's any other questions, I'm more than happy to answer them now. Just go ahead and type them into that question box. If not, I want to thank everyone for your time. My name is Dave Hernandez again. Oh, I got a couple more here. Okay, where does the program manager function stand on need? It's one of our smaller subcommittees, though. Even though they're fairly small, though they've been very active in developing that. So we have had quite a few meetings with them, but we can actually very much use some more help on that also if you'd like. That's one that we could definitely use some more help on. Has the inspector group been started? No, the first 2 meetings for that have already been scheduled, but they have not happened yet. We have one scheduled, I believe it's in 2 weeks, the first meeting, and the next one is in early November. So that one's kicking off the ground now. Okay. I don't have any other questions here, so I want to thank everyone for your time. I really appreciate everyone that took the time to be with us today. As we mentioned before, this will be available, so please feel free to share this with anyone. If you want additional information on this, or if you want to share this with someone and have them contact me directly, I'll be more than happy to share information with them about the JTA. This is a very important process for us. This is something that we're investing a lot of time and effort into because we think it's important to really understand this information. So I appreciate the fact that everyone was with us today, and have a wonderful day.